Hello. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the major drug classifications. I'm going to be talking about classifications by origin, therapeutic use, site of action, chemical structure, mechanism of action, and street name, why we use each of those classifications, and then I'm going to go over the distinction between a drug effect and a drug experience. So we use classifications basically to categorize different drugs and to predict what a new substance is likely to do. For instance, we know that there are consistent principles of how a drug affects an individual based on the route through which the drug is administered. Drugs that are injected tend to reach the brain at stronger doses and at faster rates than drugs that are consumed orally. Drugs that are placed on the skin tend to be even slower to reach the brain than those that are swallowed, etc. Not only that, but drugs that have a similar chemical structure tend to have similar effects on the body. So opiates are a large category of drugs that all affect the system in the brain that basically detects the presence of pain and distress within the body. And so drugs that have this chemical structure all operate on a similar action and all cause the body to stop perceiving pain and distress signals. So drugs can be classified by their origin. So classifying by origin divides drugs into categories based on where they come from. For instance, synthetic drugs, or sometimes called club drugs, are generally drugs that are the product of extensive processing. So methamphetamine, or meth, is generally produced through basically boiling and combining and reducing down many different synthetic substances that have themselves already undergone a great deal of processing. So a synthetic drug is generally one that is basically takes a lot of processing to achieve, where meth has to be developed in a specialized lab a lot of the time in order to exist and does not really occur on its own. Plant-based drugs, on the other hand, are generally drugs that occur on their own in nature. A lot of the time they derive from plants or fungi, and these are going to be drugs that generally are extracted with relative ease from these plants and do not require extensive additional processing. So, for instance, the poppy flower is the source of opium, and opium, if it's concentrated, is heroin. So it's generally pretty easy to obtain heroin from poppy flowers if one simply grows the flowers. I also want to note the fact that we're going to be talking about this myth pretty extensively, but there is this myth that substances that are natural are somehow automatically healthier or safer than substances that are synthetic. In reality, however, some of the most dangerous drugs we're going to be talking about in this class are 100% natural and occur organically and can be grown by anybody who has the right, plant, but can unfortunately have severe harms to the body and result in addiction and death, as in the case of derivatives from the poppy flower. There are also a lot of synthetic drugs that are extremely safe and can be used for a long time with relatively little risk to the individual. So acetaminophen, the over-the-counter painkiller, is regarded as being extremely safe for use, where overdoses are pretty rare and negative side effects are extremely rare, but that's also a synthetic drug. So synthetic doesn't mean that it's less safe. Natural doesn't mean it's more safe. It's kind of unrelated to the properties of the drug. the origin of the drug. So classifying drugs by therapeutic use basically is categorizing drugs based on the conditions that they are designed to treat. So we refer to drugs such as acetaminophen or Tylenol and ibuprofen or Advil as painkillers. We also include substances with a stronger mechanism of action, such as Vicodin, an opiate, under that heading of painkillers. So obviously the term then refers to the fact that these are substances that reduce the subjective experience of pain, or they kill your pain. So that's where that term comes from, or that category comes from, is the condition that they treat is pain. Another common categorization based on therapeutic use is antidepressants. So antidepressants is a somewhat inaccurate everyday term for over the counter and usually prescription drugs that are used as long-term treatment for mood disorders and sometimes anxiety disorders. So I know that a lot of psychiatrists especially are pushing to move away from the term antidepressants because oftentimes they're prescribed for conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder or general anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. So they're not just used to treat depression. However, these broad category of drugs, monoamine oxidase inhibitor drugs, or MAOI drugs, fluoxetine, which is commonly known by its trade name of Prozac. They're very different on a chemical structure. They have different origins. They have different specific effects on the neurotransmitters of the brain. But what they have in common is that they were both developed to treat clinical depression, and therefore they're both referred to as antidepressants. So just as, again, there's a vast difference between ibuprofen and, an opiate, but they're both used to treat pains. They're both referred to as painkillers. There are vast differences between the different types of antidepressants, such as the tricyclics versus the SSRIs, but they were all originally developed as treatments for clinical depression, and so they're all referred to as antidepressants. So classifying drugs by therapeutic use is basically classifying them according to the conditions that they're designed to treat. So classifying drugs based on site of action is basically a way of classifying drugs by what areas of the body they affect. And the reason that this classification is really important is because two drugs that appear different on the surface and have different molecular structures, etc., can nevertheless have similar effects on the body, which can result in toxicity and overdose. So depressants are basically drugs that slow down the functioning of the autonomic nervous system, or they cause breathing, heart rate, digestion, and other automatic motions within the body to be slower and, in essence, more relaxed. So again, all of those automatic bodily processes slow down under the influence of alcohol, under the influence of cannabis, under the influence of over-the-counter and prescription drugs such as Tylenol, such as Xanax, which is an anti-anxiety drug. And the reason it's important to classify all of these as depressants is because combining these drugs can be extremely dangerous. So actor Heath Ledger unfortunately passed away because he combined a prescription sleep aid with an alcoholic drink, unaware that both resulted in depressing the actions of his circulatory system and his breathing, and passed away as a result because his breathing and heart rate slowed to the point where these were no longer able to be sustained by his body, and he passed away. So depressants are, again, ones that slow down the central nervous system. And then we also talk about a broad category of hormone therapies. So hormone therapies alter mechanisms of the glands, and Hormone therapies, again, have a variety of different effects. We're going to be talking a little bit about androgens and steroids, birth control, which are generally drugs that affect the mechanisms of the ovaries. And all of these drugs, again, are really important to classify as hormone therapies because they have similar mechanisms of action and can combine in ways that result in negative effects, even if they're safe for use on their own. And for instance, you can safely take birth control and alcohol in combination, but again, taking alcohol and cannabis in combination can be very dangerous. Consuming alcohol with a prescription sleep aid is extremely dangerous. And therefore, it's important to classify by site of action in order to understand why these drugs sometimes combine in dangerous ways. So classifying drugs based on chemical structure is exactly what it sounds like. Basically finding the base substance that comprises multiple different drug substances and classifying them according to the base substance they have in common. So we're going to be talking about amphetamines. So methamphetamine, commonly referred to as glass because of its appearance, or speed because of its effects on the body. And then MDMA, or methyl N-dioxymethamphetamine, commonly referred to as E, probably because that's less of a mouthful. Both derive their chemical structure from amphetamines. And we're going to be talking about how amphetamines specifically affect serotonin, dopamine, and some other systems within the body. And then barbiturates are a classification of chemicals and drugs that originally were prescribed over the counter to treat anxiety. Nowadays have largely fallen out of therapeutic use, but continue to have recreational use. So that includes phenobarbital and armobarbital. And these are going to be, again, drugs that have a common, basically chemical substance as their base. So opiates, another one where we talk about synthetic opiates, and we talk about basically, morphine-based opiates, etc. And in each case, they have a different chemical structure as their origin. So classifying by mechanism of action basically sorts drugs based on the effects that they produce on specifically neurotransmitters. So for instance, dopamine agonists, and we're going to get into what dopamine agonists are in, I believe, chapter 3, are drugs that cause dopamine to be more effective at producing subjective feelings of reward, action, perception, etc. within the brain. And so dopamine agonists are drugs that act on the dopamine system and increase the effectiveness of dopamine. So LSD, or lysergic acid, and major tranquilizers such as Thorazine, used to treat schizophrenia, both act upon the dopamine system and increase the effectiveness of dopamine inflowing through the brain. And then GABA agonists act on the GABA system, and they tend to basically inhibit major brain functioning because GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and they make GABA more effective at its job of inhibiting various brain functioning. So that includes alcohol and barbiturates. Notice again that this kind of provides us a clue about the drugs that are safe and not safe to combine. So combining alcohol and LSD might result in, a kind of odd acid trip, but otherwise is probably safe. Combining alcohol and barbiturates, unfortunately, was the source of many fatalities back when barbiturates were more commonly combined. And unfortunately, alcohol and barbiturates in combination has been used as a date rape drug in the past. So sorting drugs by street name basically takes the common slang term for these drugs and looks at where that name came from, why that name exists, and what that name can tell us about the mechanism of action. So street name classifications are actually very useful from a psychopharmacology perspective in that they can tell us about the subjective experience of using a drug. So for instance, cocaine and amphetamines are referred to as uppers. And the reason they're called uppers is because they result in an increase in mood and energy. So consuming cocaine and consuming amphetamines, they're similar subjective experiences. They both result in, as I said, an increase in concentration, in mood, in feelings of happiness, and basically higher energy levels. They have different, durations, different methods of consumption, but the subjective experience for the body is similar. And then downers, so that's kind of a general name for drugs that cause one's mood to decrease and result in relaxation, generally because they result in energy levels going down and induce sleepiness and a lessening of anxiety. So ketamine and barbiturates are generally referred to as downers. So street name classifications are sometimes misleading, and we're going to be talking about that later, but they are sometimes useful in that they help us to understand similar subjective experiences across drugs. So, drug effects are the actual physiological changes produced in the body. So, the reason that drug effects are different from drug experiences is that drug effects are the ways that the actual functioning of the brain and or body is altered by contact with a particular drug. So drug effects are going to be the same on a cellular level in the sense that, if you consume alcohol, then your GABA system is going to become more effective, or basically you're going to have an increase in GABA within your system. And again, that's a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. And so you're going to see an inhibition of functioning within the brain. However, drug experiences vary from user to user, and what that inhibition of functioning within the brain looks like is going to be different for different people as they consume alcohol. So drug experiences are basically the actual changes in your behavior, your mood, and what you think and feel when under the influence of a particular drug. And so while these are going to be dependent partially on the structure of the drug and the route of administration, they're also going to be dependent on the user's expectations. They're going to be dependent on the situation in which the drug is used, and they're going to be dependent on basically other factors of the psychology or the mood of the user. So pharmacological factors that change drug experiences include dose and route of administration. So as I said, route of administration is going to basically change how much of the drug actually reaches the body. So a drug that's placed on the skin is going to have to cross far more barriers before it begins to affect brain functioning than a drug that is injected directly into the circulatory system. A drug that is consumed orally is going to have a different effect than a drug that is inhaled. So for instance, opiates, we know that Vicodin, which is consumed orally, generally affects the brain at a different rate and generally has a slower, longer term, less intense effect than heroin, which is comparable chemical structure, but is injected rather than being swallowed and has a faster, more intense effect. Drug experiences are affected by characteristics of the drug user. So we talk about people having this basically psychological set for what they expect to get out of a drug. So for instance, people who expect that consuming marijuana is going to result in extreme changes to their body, their mood, their appetite, their overall functioning, maybe because of some of the like really extreme scare tactics that you sometimes encounter in anti-drug programs in school, are going to actually experience a more extreme high under the influence of cannabis than somebody who maybe understands that it has relatively mild effects on mood and physiology, and maybe grew up in an era when marijuana is already legal in several states and isn't presented with these scare tactics like it will change your entire brain functioning, the way that somebody who grew up earlier may have seen that. We also see that you can get some interesting placebo effects. If people have a very strong expectation about how a drug will affect them, they will start to experience effects of that drug, whether or not they actually consumed any of it. So a placebo is, in essence, a fake drug, or it is a pill or substance that contains no active mood altering substances that is then given to the user, and the user is told that it contains one or more drugs. So you can see a placebo effect. For instance, if you give college students non-alcoholic beer, especially younger college students who have a strong expectation of alcohol producing positive mood changes and extreme alterations in behavior, will begin to basically behave drunk after consuming non-alcoholic beer that they do not know is non-alcoholic, because they have a strong expectation that consuming beer will result in drunkenness. This happens sometimes when people consume a non-alcoholic margarita mix, believing that it's alcoholic, where they begin to say, oh, well, I'm getting fuzzy-headed and I start to feel drunk, even though they've consumed no actual alcohol. So characteristics of the drug user, especially expectations about the drug and past experiences with the drug, are going to change the experience of that drug. And then setting of use. So the setting of use is basically the circumstances under which the drug is administered or consumed. So we know that there's different subjective experiences associated with using legal drugs versus illegal drugs. We know that there are different subjective experiences associated with consuming a drug with friends versus doing it alone versus doing it with strangers. So if any of you are old enough to drink in bars and have had the experience of having a few drinks in a bar versus having a few drinks by yourself at home, you know that alcohol has different subjective effects on the mood based on the setting in which one consumes the drug. So drug effects are going to be the actual chemical changes that result on a cellular level from the drug. Drug experiences are going to be subjective changes to the way that the individual thinks and feels and acts as a result of consuming the drug, and they're going to be influenced not only by the drug itself, but by the user and by the setting.